So we've, after hearing a lot, talking to a lot of people on the street, making observations, we started to kind of, let's say, develop a series of guiding principles that can kind of help frame a vision. And I'm just going to go through, there's about 7 of them. The first is really to take the kind of greatest asset of this more local context, which is the Arboretum, and how to amplify that context. And the way that can very literally translate is like, how can we green the streets? How can we bring a botanical presence to the streets that's unlike any other in the city? And how can we actually emphasize some of the great trees that already exist along the street? And then create conditions to grow way better street trees than we do currently have along most of this corridor. And of course, the technical requirements to do that is will be the subject of detail. But the ambition to actually bring an Arboretum feel through the corridor of Mount Pleasant. Second is to create a better interface with the park. So June Rollins Park is an amazing asset. It's a center of the community. Its relationship to Mount Pleasant, in fact, is its weakest edge. And that's a shame. And that's an opportunity as well. So we think that there's a huge role here in this project in thinking about the street beyond just the pavement, beyond the sidewalk, and that interface, that exchange with the park itself as a huge opportunity. And we know that there are issues with how sports are buffered with that roadway. Perhaps there's a way to think about that, that interface, that line between sports recreation and the park and the public realm in a more positive way. Third, and this is so basic, but it needs to be stated: a safer experience. This is a community where that exchanges from east to west across this street. The crossings are, this is like, I feel like it's like squirrels moving, and the kids who are moving from Greenwood across to the park, or just generally the crossing of this street in various locations is challenging. So we take that seriously and think about retaining the capacity of the street and the movement and the flow of the street, but actually making sure we can improve the crossings and the permeability across east to west. So that means adding the additions of safe crosswalks and crossings along in addition to the ones that you have. And fourthly, thinking about an expanded public realm. And this is kind of almost the core of the project, to think of where space can be regained in rebalancing the street as a whole. So looking at the right-of-way from building edge to building edge, as it stands today and as it is expected to develop, and thinking about the role of, how much width you assign to each lane of movement of traffic, how you think about an organized parking, and then where are the opportunities where the sidewalk and the public spaces can actually be expanded. We think in doing that, there can be a real emphasis on the role of the corners of streets, and those corners as places of gathering, of meeting, and of course as a way to make safe crossings. There have been really interesting examples around the city that the BIA has helped support. Roncesvalles is one of them. Simple reconfigurations of curbs and laneways, creating bump outs where you can increase planting, create conditions to grow bigger trees that will actually thrive. It can start to change the dimension of the street, your feeling of the street radically. We think thinking in those simple terms, especially around corners and crossings, is going to be a huge possibility.
And actually, maybe just to add, corners are where it kind of comes together, both in terms of the guiding principles, safety. This is where you cross, and it's going to enhance the lighting. So yeah, corners are where it comes together because it's, you move along the street. It's good for business to be able to cross easily so that you can hop backwards and forwards between stores. It makes it safer if we can cut down the distance as you cross. It's your way into a street. You don't just join at one end and you go all the way along and then you leave at the other. This is your gateway into a street. So as you move east-west in this case, that's how you enter Mount Pleasant. So it's your first experience, and if we can make it a green one, we think it's a better experience. I'll run through these. Multiple scales within one vision. Here, I'm just trying to say that you look at the place and you kind of get a feeling that there's a certain cadence as you move along the street. By that we mean it's not all the same. And we think that's a strength. So for different kinds of buildings, for different kinds of widths and scales and heights, we think that matters, and we think that the solution should respond to that. We see at least 4 different experiences along this street. We see coming out of the Arboretum and the green immersion, which includes the great park we just mentioned. We sense a kind of potential village scale where the narrow shop fronts all come together and the lower heights make it feel very intimate. We sense an area where there's more of a kind of a mid-rise scale, longer buildings, a little bit taller, and we know that, of course, with the Eglinton Crosstown going in, we're going to see some more development probably north of Sudan and up to Eglinton. That's somewhat inevitable with the infrastructure that's going in place, and how do you make that a virtue?
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
I think one of the exciting aspects of all those scales is to be able to live. I think it's one of the reasons people live in this neighborhood and generally in Midtown and these neighborhoods where you have access to incredible green, sort of lush openness, and then on the other hand, a real sense of urban life. And so within this spectrum from the green to the metropolitan, that's actually in a remarkably close proximity. So it's the fact that, and at the core of that, having a kind of village, a thriving village at the crest of and center of your community, within 5 blocks either way, you're either in the best arboretum in the city or one of the most bustling lines of Eglinton. That's really exciting. And that's sort of, I think, part of what makes this neighborhood unique.
Yeah, and then simply pedestrian comfort. Not just a place to walk along and move along, but just really simple things like, how could we spend time on this street? How could it be kind of like a park that you might actually stop and how could shop fronts, and we were just here. We just actually had pizza in the place that has the bench, and we just thought, what a great idea to actually invite people to stay a while, and that can be on the street, or also you have some great pops, that's privately owned public spaces. And actually this isn't a pop, by the way. This is a city park, there's a parkette, but there are pops as well along here which you can occupy, and we can actually make these into more attractive public spaces. And then the last one is, are there places which we have maybe overlooked which could be active now? We're just throwing up examples and we'll show more later, but can we get a taste of what's to come whilst we've made the report and then we're waiting for bigger things to happen, such as development or capital projects? And of course we think the answer is yes. Look, we've seen examples around the world. This one's in New York where it's as simple as a parking space getting taken over on a temporary basis as a public space. It's not built in a manner that would last 50 years, but maybe it gives a hint as to where the street could go. And actually it's been done here, of course. This is in Toronto. This is what happened on Yonge Street for the period of one summer in 2010, I think. And so we know that this is a way that you can get a hint of what's to come without the massive capital investment of the big infrastructure project.
Okay, I'm just going to go through the sort of the conceptual framework for the vision, and then we'll get into the master plan itself and go on a kind of block by block basis through the plan. But I think this is, conceptually what we're really trying to do is bring an idea to the street. This is a street that somehow it's been a bit ad hoc in how the street has been designed. And there's a real chance to sort of recognize what its role could be in the city and to actually allow it to sort of fulfill that role. We wonder if, it's a question, but could Mount Pleasant become Toronto's most picturesque arboretum-like street? That we could take that power and presence of the arboretum and the greenness of that and pull that through the design of the streetscape itself. That would, effectively mean that you were not only sort of Mount Pleasant Village, but you were actually this green heart of the, central to the city. And that would mean like thinking about that structure of Mount Pleasant Cemetery in the south end of your neighborhood, and the sort of the intensity of Eglinton Avenue in the north end of your neighborhood, and then just the idea of just pulling that beautiful diversity botanically out of the park and onto the street, and thinking about how we could encourage a street to be designed in this way, almost designed like as a designed landscape. Streetscape generally are sort of very engineered. The conditions to grow trees are often the afterthought once all the utilities and things are in place. But if you start to now in the 21st century, we can kind of flip our heads around actually how we think of designing and organizing the right-of-way of a street. And it may be possible to sort of take hints from the design of this cemetery. By the way, doing a little bit of research about the cemetery, it's fascinating. I'm sure you all know about it, but it was a real landmark that this was one of the sort of early designed landscapes, in fact, where the trustees of the cemetery hired at the time a very important landscape designer, H.A. Engelhardt, and he had just written this book called The Beauties of Nature, which is hard to find a first edition. I've never read the work. It was from the 1870s, and he basically sort of lays out, it was the first Canadian landscape designer who laid out kind of a theory about picturesque garden design. And so it's important kind of in the history of designed landscapes, and you can see that the design of this cemetery was very different than previous cemeteries. It was really designed with these sort of serpentine routes, and it looks a lot like the kind of English park movement of the time. And of course, the diversity of the species is what's so remarkable. And if you go in there, it's like it's a time machine, because you're transported back to the late 19th century, and you're seeing specimens that are the oldest ones in the city. So if you haven't been there, and I'm sure you all haven't, go there and just to see the trees. It's like you're seeing the grandfathers of our city. So anyway, this sort of this resource just at the foot of your neighborhood, we think is very instructive to thinking about a street design. And of course, there's a sort of amazing diversity of species in there. Not all of those are destined to be the ultimate street tree. Of course, there are soil conditions, there's pollution conditions, there's salt conditions, there's roadway conditions that we have to think about. But actually, to create the conditions for a healthy tree to grow, to be mature with a great canopy, is definitely possible and doable. We have much better technologies to make that happen. So we wonder, could Mount Pleasant be defined by its trees? Like some streets are great streets in the world. In Washington, D.C., in New York City, in Buenos Aires, in San Francisco, in Barcelona, where a street takes on an identity because of its botanics. We think that could be a really exciting thing for this street, not only in the trees, but then actually in some of the details that start to land in the paving, in some of the other urban furniture and elements. And when you look at sort of moments in the cemetery, these are shots from Mount Pleasant Cemetery. You see actually in the center here, this is the tree species labeling, the plaques that are on the botanical garden where you can tell what the tree name is. There's a few remaining from that original 19th century that are wood, painted wood signs. So we imagine in a botanical street that you might have actually be able to know the names of all the street trees in your neighborhood. And on the right, those are the original flagstone path that was created in the first phase. So just starting to think, how could we move from a kind of repertoire from a garden to something robust enough for a street, but to keep kind of the feeling of textures, of a kind of tactility and warmth that you expect in a garden, and to think even sort of on the level of the canopy, but also on the level of the ground and the understory plantings, that we could really think of species that have a seasonal quality, but also could bring life and beauty to the street. Again, the idea that then to recognize what are those species, to think of other elements from a garden that could maybe be scaled up to a larger scale that's more robust, again, like at a park scale, to think of then the pergola or trellis elements, but perhaps in relation to June Rollins Park.